Hi everyone. Sorry for not putting up a video for last week. I was out of town for a while and then I was sick. Actually, I'm still a little bit sick, so I didn't comment on last week's readings. So this week I'll comment, I'll recap a little bit of last week, and then we'll talk about the chapters that we have in front of us for now. Um, this is one of those weeks where we will have to all do this together because the presenter who was supposed to be on is not in the class anymore, and so that just puts the onus on all of us to actually read and understand what code is talking about. Um, Let me make a couple of other comments before we get into the material itself. The As you know, there's an assignment that is due, and it's due this week. And so I hope you've been thinking about that. I know several of you have. You've talked to me about your various ideas for papers, and so thank you for that. If you upload that assignment to the wiki, I will grade it as quickly as possible. I'd like to turn it around pretty quickly so you have some time to actually think about your project, to refine it a bit, and so forth. Um, and hopefully I'll probably put little video comments for each of you that only you will see as well, just to kind of try and address things as sufficiently as possible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what code is up to, and we've got a good chunk of stuff to work through here right now. Code, this book in some ways is kind of the, I won't say toughest read of the course, but certainly involved. It's certainly she is drawing on a lot of her own past writing within feminism, within epistemology in general, and within a number of other areas, social theory, and so it is presupposing a certain amount of experience and knowledge. That's not, I'm not apologizing for that. That's simply how it is, and so I think it's worth thinking a little bit about where she's coming from with some of this and trying to unpack some of her arguments. As I say, I want to recap a little bit of what she was doing in chapters 2 and 3, which were last week's chapters. In chapter 2, we have her trying to resist the notion that there's a clear and easy distinction between what happens in science and what happens in what you might call interpretation. This is a distinction that comes out of hermeneutics. It comes out of particularly Wilhelm Dilthey. I think I might have mentioned this before, his distinction between Naturwissenschaften, which is the natural sciences or natural knowledge, and Geisteswissenschaften, which is the human sciences. And so he makes this distinction in order to argue that, in order to argue against a kind of Comtean sort of positivism, to try and say, look, there's a body of human knowledge and experience that cannot be reduced to simply natural science methods. And so Dilthey's goal is to establish a certain kind of approach to the human sciences, to human knowledge, that is in some ways more holistic, in some ways just really tries to get at the social nature of human experience. And so this is picked up. Heidegger talks about it. Gadamer very much talks about it in Truth and Method. And what Dilthey, and we often see this in philosophy, what somebody sets up to address a particular problem at the time can introduce its own problems. We saw that with Kant, for example. Immanuel Kant figured that he had, set up a system in which he had dealt with the problems of empiricism that were appearing at his time through people like Berkeley and Hume. And, so what he was going to do is to talk about metaphysics as something which was part of our approach to the world, part of our way of understanding the world. And so no longer did we have to try and speculate about what the external world held. Now we had a solid basis. Some things could be scientifically understood. Other things he kicked out of that sphere, like God, like the self, like ethics, politics, various things like this. So we had, he set up this division in order to have to solve a problem, essentially. That division produced its own problems. All right, I mean, the division produced the problems of the compartmentalization of knowledge and experience. Is it really the case that we can't know anything about the self, about ethics, and so forth in that kind of rigorous sense of knowledge? And so, we have there an example of something that Dilthey, I suppose, was also doing. And Dilthey was setting up this distinction in order to solve a problem. But what we end up with is the notion that humans cannot be thought of in scientific terms. That would reduce them. That would do violence to them. And on the other hand, there's no kind of human aspect within the natural sciences themselves. And so many, including Gadamer, certainly including Code, would resist that. They don't want to make that nice, easy distinction. Um, and I think Code particularly would argue that that's what's behind this notion of the mastery of the world. If we have a domain in which we can know cause and effect relationships, it's public information, it's publicly available to everyone, and so forth. And then there's a different domain, which is the domain of opinion or personal experience or whatever. Then we can say, well, here's where real knowledge exists, and so forth. And Code wants to say, no, no, no. That is to denigrate or to dismiss the knowledge that actually exists within the realm of interpretation. And so what she's trying to do is recover a way of thinking about knowledge within the human sphere that that if not public in that hard sense of public, in other words, available to everyone at the same time in all circumstances, at least it's the sort of thing that we can talk about, that we can, as she later talks about, advocacy, that we can advocate for, and that should be part of our certainly ethics and social theory. So that's part of what's going on in chapter 2. Um, she wants to suggest that there is a kind of situatedness to our knowledge, that um, that we carry our histories within us. She talks about organisms are not just inert things, but they carry their history within us. And so it's more than just knowing about the mechanisms of things. It requires knowing about consequences. It requires knowing about impact, things of that nature. To know is to know all of those things as well. Now, to a very kind of hard-nosed epistemologist, that might be inclined to say, well, all of that stuff comes after knowing what is or knowing the truth about something. And I think Code wants to blur that boundary between that kind of hard-nosed epistemologist and, if you wish, the applications of epistemology. I mean, I think she wants to say, look, we can't suppose that we can get that kind of the truth about things divorced from the social implications in the world in which that knowledge actually exists. And in this, she really kind of, she's not a postmodernist in that kind of sense of relativist or something like that, but she does fall within the phenomenological tradition, and particularly the hermeneutical tradition. In a certain sense, the meaningfulness of the world precedes the truth about it. In other words, we have to know the kind of meaningful world we find ourselves in order to figure out how truth presents itself. Heidegger uses this term aletheia, which is uncovering. And there are more and more even analytic philosophers, epistemologists that are finding some interesting content, interesting ideas within Heidegger's notion of truth. So it's not necessarily that hard and fast divide that it used to be. All right, so quick gloss in chapter 2. Chapter 3, she talks about facts, and as one might expect, she's not going to regard facts as kind of bald givens of the world. I mean, just the sort of thing that we find lying around, inert objects, atomistic things that we assemble into something else. Facts are something more complex than that. They do come situated. We might think that facts are the sorts of things that we need to have prior to any further knowledge, but she is not interested in supposing that those sorts of things exist at arm's length, objectively in the world, without any context, without any reference to the one who is understanding or knowing those facts. So there's some good examples of the ways in which things that we might take as givens. There's the example of the three bears, and she uses this in the next chapter actually, but it's relevant here too, I think. A child is asked about the story of the three bears and which is the biggest bear, Papa bear, Mama bear, baby bear. And in a certain sense, the obvious answer to that is, well, Papa Bear is the biggest of the three of these. But children would often answer that Mama Bear was the biggest. Now, how does this make any sense at all? Well, one could in part see it as having a kind of moral sense, right? I mean, just as in medieval paintings, the largest figure might be the most morally significant figure. So Jesus is at the center, and he's big, the largest figure in the canvas, and then Mary and Joseph are there, and they're three-quarter size, and so forth. Everything goes down from there. And so, what we have here is a sense of, a moral fact about the universe, not necessarily a physical fact. Now, if I ask you which is the biggest, we automatically jump to the notion that what we're talking about is the physical biggest. What if that's not the frame of reference, right? I mean, what if that's not the question being asked? Michel Mayer, who's a French philosopher, has written quite a lot on the notion that the gold standard in philosophy should be not the claim but the question. We need to understand the question that's being asked, and once we understand that, we will see how claims issue from that. And so, this is a prime example of that, right? I mean, if I ask you which is the largest, we bring certain content to that question. The largest, well, you must mean the physically largest. Well, what if a little kid's notion of largest, the mother is the most prominent figure in that child's life at the moment, let's suppose. That is a credible interpretation, it seems to me, of the notion of largest. Not the one that most of us would come to, but nonetheless, it seems credible to me. It's all governed by understanding the question that's being asked and understanding the frame of reference in which that question is being asked. And so, what we have here, I think, is, an interesting insight, because when we think of epistemology, we think of, knowledge that is in a certain sense divorced from its context. Certainly that's true for much modern epistemology. The question has always been, what constitutes a content of our knowledge? And we often don't delve far enough into asking who's asking, what context, what for, what's the background, all of those sorts of questions. And so I think in a part, at the most basic level, Code is bringing this up. And it should be noticed that, her frame of reference is feminist philosophy. But as I've said before, you should not think of this as necessarily a feminist argument. I mean, she's using feminist sources, but it might be easy to kind of dismiss her, if you don't particularly like feminism for some reason, as, well, this is just a feminist argument. I think it's more interesting than that. I mean, I think what she's doing here is using the tools at her disposal to address this issue. There's a lot of good content that's been done by feminists, and that I think can't simply be, put to the side just by virtue of the fact that it's feminist philosophy. And so, I am one who wants to say, no, this needs to be included and then interrogated, in the same way that we would interrogate any other kind of source of our philosophical content. Doesn't mean I agree with everyone or disagree with everyone, although I think, a great deal of what Code is talking about here, I think, has a lot of interesting merit to it. Code in chapter 3 points back to Donna Haraway, who talks about situated knowledge. She talks about what she calls the God trick. That is the notion of a view from nowhere. We suppose that in epistemology we stand back and we can pretend that we're God. And what Code is really trying to argue against is that that's a realistic basis for supposing that we're coming to some knowledge about the world. She would argue, in fact, that that's actually a rather biased sort of approach to the world. And it supposes that epistemology is an isolated sort of thing. So along with Haraway, she's trying to get back to this notion that there's a situatedness to knowledge, while at the same time not going as far as supposing that puts us all in straitjackets. I mean, that is the other problem, isn't it, with epistemology that acknowledges place. And that is that we might take that far enough to be able to say, well, place is a straitjacket. I am from my place, you're from your place. I can't possibly understand anything about you, and vice versa. And I don't think Code or most other sophisticated thinkers want to say that. I mean, Place isn't like that. Place is not a silo or a hermetically sealed thing or a straitjacket or whatever metaphor you want. It's porous at the edges. You know, there are competencies. Heidegger talks about the care structure that, in our world, we understand that world in certain ways to the extent that the world becomes transparent to us. That's what he means by care, right? So I use a pen or a pencil, and I think with the pencil. I don't think about the pencil until the lead breaks, and then I have to think about it, right? So it's transparent, and that means that it is part of my care structure. It's part of my world of meaning. Well, so place is not the sort of thing that has a hermetically sealed sort of notion. People in other parts of the world can figure that pencil out. It wouldn't take them very, very long to do so. We can move back and forth. We can encounter each other. We can teach each other and learn from each other. We can do all of these sorts of things. The point is not that, there is one, epistemology that is relevant to women and another one that's relevant to Africans or whatever. It's that as we think about what constitutes knowledge, we have to take its place into account while recognizing that knowledge always strives for, if not the universal, more general applicability. Okay? So I think that's part of what she's trying to do in chapter 3. So let's go on to look at chapters 4 and 5, which are the chapters for this week. And she's really dealing with a couple of different kind of core examples or core kind of areas here. In the chapter 4, she's talking about the example of the child. And in this, she is raising a number of, I think, interesting issues. One of them is, if we're thinking about cognition, well, she's moving towards a notion of cognition. Let's say that first, right? As we use it in cognitive science, cognition is wrapped up with epistemological and philosophy of mind issues, but it's also wrapped up with developmental issues, so it includes psychology. It's wrapped up with nature of language. It's wrapped up with various forms of modeling and a number of things like that. So cognition is a kind of many faceted sort of notion. Epistemology is really only a part of what happens there. She's in my mind, she's including more of a kind of cognitive sort of side to what she's doing here by raising questions about Piaget and about other developmental psychologists and their accounts of the development of the child. Why should development be of relevance to a philosopher? Well, in part, if we've broken down the notion that epistemology is just a view from nowhere, then we have to start asking, well, where is the somewhere? I mean, what are the contexts that we bring to our way of structuring knowledge in the world? And that's not just about the kind of haphazard contents of our mental states that we have. I mean, I've seen some trees, you've seen other trees. I've seen some cats, you've seen other cats, whatever. That's experience, that's perception, if you wish, but there's also knowledge involved with this. Remember when I talked last week, I think it was on the one of the discussions about the kind of classic, by classic I mean modern classic version of knowledge. Knowledge as true justified belief, right? And so in a certain sense, we have to raise questions about each of those things. What constitutes true? What kind of justification is appropriate? And what happens when justifications butt heads with each other? And what constitutes belief? Is it just having a content of the mind, or is it something else? And so, if we're broadening that notion of epistemology to include the question of, let's say, how justification might be rooted in a kind of context of what is convincing in the world, or where knowledge comes from, or which knowledge community supports it, or how testimony works, as we'll see in the next chapter. If all of that comes to bear on this, then yeah, talking about childhood development actually does become relevant. What Code wants to do here, it seems to me, is resist the kind of notion of normalization, and she talks about this later in the chapter, resist normalization in the sense of many of the studies of children have focused on the ideal child or the normal child, which has often ended up being a child who's white, a child who's male, a child who's from a particular economic background, or things of that nature. And so we've tended to generalize based on supposing that all children are the same, when in fact, it's not necessarily the case. And that's, at its base, that's a pretty obvious criticism, I think, of many studies. That is that the sample does not match the population, right? And so what I think Code is after here is raising questions not only about the normal child, but about the standard or normal human, right? I mean, the studies also presume that knowledge, the true form of knowledge, knowledge at its best or knowledge at its most real, is the knowledge that white, male, affluent people of a certain age actually have. And she, I think, rightly raises the question, what if that's not the case? What if there are forms of knowledge that are parts of other groups that have not been taken into account? Why is it that it's essentially that group that gets to model what counts as knowledge? And so, she picks up that question. She uses Wittgenstein quite a lot a certain version of Wittgenstein, at least, to argue that there's some, that he prefigured some of this, and I think she's right about that. He questions, he does it through the nature of language in a certain sense, but he's interested in linguistic communities and not supposing that there's one community that in some sense is the right one. There's no Queen's English, as it were. There's no one community that is the determining community for all other linguistic communities as to how things ought to work. And she's thinking in knowledge in the same terms. So in this chapter that she uses her three bears example, and she uses some other examples here as well to try and break down the notion that there's a kind of givenness about human knowledge. That to suggest that what we count as knowledge often is really knowledge that is indexed to a particular group and then generalized from there. And it's clear that what she's talking about here is not just any old knowledge. It's very much knowledge that's within a kind of social context, an ethical context. It's not necessarily, let's say, knowledge about the nature of the atom or something like that. I mean, she may, I'm sure, have things to say about that. But throughout this book, you see that the knowledge that she's really interested in is knowledge that is about our ethical place in the world, about the ethical place of various groups in the world, about the notion that some groups, because of what counts as knowledge, have not been able to articulate their place. They cannot be understood. As Gayatri Spivak said, the subaltern cannot be heard. And so, and so I think, she's very much, as with the kind of, title of the course, she's very much putting knowledge along with responsibility in society here. We could talk about scientific knowledge in the more abstract sense, and I think with Philip Kitcher's book after this, we probably will be doing that. But Code's focus is very much the kind of social world. So, so she wants to see the child in all of this as not just a kind of bald fact of the world that can be researched. The other issue at stake here is, does the child get to say anything? And this issue comes up even more so in her next chapter when she starts with the extended example of the medical world. The child in this case has a similar status to the patient. Does the patient get to say anything about their own situation? Are they listened to, or are they simply more data for somebody to interpret? The kind of classic image of the medical world is the world in which the doctor is the one who's trained. He or she listens to the patient only in as much as the patient is able to communicate things like symptoms. The broader experience of the patient is not relevant to the diagnosis, and therefore the doctor, as much as possible, would like to mute patient so that that patient can be investigated as an object of science, if you wish. And Code is resisting that, and Gadamer before her resists it, and I think any number of people within disability studies would echo the same thing. This is a great example of a case in which there's a knowledge being constructed about a group of people, patients in this case, that has consequences to it, that may end up leading you down the wrong path if you don't have all the information. It's easy to jump to conclusions, especially with a complex entity like a human body. And so, Code's argument here, I think, also is that we really need to understand that knowledge is created not just as a kind of the mastery of the world, as she would put it, but as a somebody is able to take into account the position of where where the object of the knowledge has been and is, and all of those sorts of things, especially when we're talking about humans. Chapter 5, she's talking about autonomy particularly. If you think about it for a second, autonomy is one of those notions which has really been at the kind of core of Enlightenment thought. Kant wrote about, in What is Enlightenment? She mentions this, sapere aude, have the courage to know yourself or to investigate yourself. And, for Kant, that's the essence of what Enlightenment actually is. It's a kind of autonomy where you can decide for yourself. And Code is not one who is trying to dismiss autonomy as a value or as a virtue. What she's trying to do, in a certain sense, is show how autonomy all by itself leads to certain places that have some serious tensions and problems with them. I mean, you know, we have sometimes assumed, and Foucault points this out as well, we have sometimes assumed that, again, the model of autonomy is the white, mature male. I mean, this goes back to Aristotle. Everything else is deficient. Slaves are deficient, women are deficient, children are deficient. The model of action in society is the mature male. And this is something Code wants to question at its most basic. And so if autonomy means separating yourself from your community of meaning, that's going to be a problem for her. I mean, she's spent the whole book to this point arguing that those communities of meaning are crucial and they're central to figuring out what constitutes knowledge and how we understand knowledge in a full-fledged fashion. And so she wants to put along with the notion of autonomy, the notion of advocacy. And advocacy for her is the ability to speak from a if you wish, marginalized position, or from a community's position that is not being heard. Okay, that's why you would advocate, right? You don't need to advocate if you are already being taken seriously, right? So advocacy assumes that ideas like testimony are part of the mix. Classically, as she points out, testimony has not been seen as one of the stronger forms of justification. We're much more interested in perception and memory. But she is arguing that testimony is an epistemological act, and in fact, it needs to be treated as a respectable source. That doesn't mean that everything anyone says goes, but that a lot of people have been essentially silenced, both individuals and groups of people, because their testimony did not fit whatever prevailing wisdom happened to be. Sometimes it was very clear that their testimony was the crucial element, and prevailing opinion was just wrong on something, right? I certainly see this within my sphere of African studies. One of the, I think the philosophical sin that has been committed against Africa has been to dismiss African lived experience, and with that dismiss African testimony about what matters in an African world. And so I'm interested in the kind of philosophy that takes that seriously at the most basic level. What does it mean to take seriously African lived experience, to not suppose that anything good there has been transported there from somewhere else, because that's a way of diminishing Africans, to not suppose that if anything deviates from my own experience, that it must be superstition or just simply wrong or something like that. What does it mean to take them as phenomenologically significant actors in their own world, at the most basic level? And so, that involves a number of things. Code talks about trust, and I think trust is an issue here. There's been a lot of mistrust in different experiences. And so I think what we've got here is, Code is moving the questions of epistemology, as I already said, towards the questions of responsibility, social ethics, social action. And I think she is, building an interesting foundation, interesting grounding for how we might think about that. As the thing I would guess I would add to her study here is something I've already mentioned, and that is the notion of questioning. What counts as true questioning? How does one listen to a question? How does one interrogate a question? I mean, for me, that is really a kind of core issue within philosophy that's been largely ignored. And I think it follows very, very nicely from what Code is trying to say. There's been a lot of focusing on the building of claims, the building of systems in which claims exist. And it seems to me if we focused a bit more on questioning, we've got something that's, I think, a lot more powerful, a lot more interesting. So that's my ramblings on the parts of Code that we have to this point, and I hope you're able to chip in on the discussions. Um, tell me what you think. Um, are there parts of it that weren't clear to you? What, where does this take us? Is what she's saying plausible? So any of those things, have at it. Thanks a lot, folks.